Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Gather Movement Learning Community this month. It's lovely to see you. Thank you so much for joining us. Gather Movement has been running learning communities for a couple of years now. Last year, we focused on thinking about foundations for flourishing unity amongst churches in their towns and cities. And this year, we're thinking more deeply about what transformation of our places looks like. Socially, culturally, and spiritually. And we're really delighted to have Patrick Regan from Kintsugi Hope with us today, who's going to help us think a bit about this. And I think I'm just going to start with a reading from Isaiah, a couple of verses, as we just begin to explore a little bit more what transformation in terms of hope and joy and peace might look like in our communities. So let me just read these verses to us as we start. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, to provide for those who grieve in Zion, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. So that frames a little bit what we're thinking about in terms of transformation of people's lives. So really pleased to have Patrick with us today. Patrick, just would you introduce yourself? You are running an organization and founded an organization called Kintsugi Hope. So we'd love you to tell us about that. Mm-hmm. But also, you recently got an OBE, and I'd love to know what was spotted about you and your work that was awarded the OBE.
Great. Well, hi everyone. It's really nice to see some of you in your boxes, and it's a real privilege to be here at the Gather Movement. And I can't really answer the OBE question. I think that that's down to other people to ask. I got awarded the OBE for services to young people and communities. And so I used to be the CEO and founder of a charity called XLP, which worked with communities across inner city London. We worked in about 9 different of London's borough, providing a whole range of intervention projects, from mobile buses. We had 3 double-decker buses, I think, that travelled on the estates, to access to work programs, to literacy, numeracy, mentoring programs, working in schools. And really, actually, it came from a verse in Joshua. I was thinking about what you were saying, Mark, about hope. There's a place in Joshua called the Valley of Achor, which was known as a place of trouble. If you know your Bibles well, it was a place where Achan sinned, and they stoned him. He nicked the booty out of Jericho, and they stoned him, and they called the place he was stoned the Valley of Achor. And throughout the Old Testament, it was known as the place of trouble. And then you get to Hosea, and there's this beautiful verse that says the Valley of Achor was turned into a door of hope. And I guess that was that sense of God's purpose for community, isn't it? That shalom that you've already talked about. And so I thought I'd share a little bit about Kintsugi Hope to start with. Then Mark's going to ask me some other questions. But for some of you who don't know what kintsugi is a Japanese word that means golden joinery. So if we get a bowl and we break it, there's one I broke earlier in Blue Peter fashion, and we tend to mend it with super glue. We hide the cracks, we pretend it's not broken. And what they do in Japan is they put a gold powder in the glue. So instead of hiding the cracks, they make a feature of the cracks. So arguably the object becomes more beautiful for being broken. It certainly becomes more unique. 5 years ago, when I was just before the pandemic, 8 months before the pandemic, I was running XLP, and to be honest with you, I was feeling pretty burnt out. And I remember saying to God, I'll do anything for you apart from run another charity, because I never want to fundraise ever again. And I'm sure many of you can relate to that. And I really felt God say, don't think charity, think movement. And I was like, what does that actually mean? Is that just one of those Christian things, that we talk about? How do you define that? And so I looked at movements, not necessarily Christian movements. I've done that in the past, but looked at things like park run. I don't know, anyone here done park run? A few people? Wow, very impressive. Park run is where hundreds of thousands of people run in parks across our country. Different cultures, different ages, different abilities. You belong, but you don't have to fit in. I actually love that. Rock choir. I mean, you may have heard of rock choir. Choirs in church halls, community halls, schools. They hire Wembley Arena and, 16,000, whatever it is. They come together, they pack it out, they sell it out. And then you watch these clips and they're different ages, different cultures, different abilities. You belong, but you don't have to fit in. I looked at Weight Watchers. Anyone here done? No, let's not do that. That's not very nice. And I looked at all these movements and I thought, what does it mean to start a movement? So we looked at Alcoholics Anonymous. We looked at things that have gone around the world. And just simply, me and my wife Diane, we wrote a 12-step program to do with well-being. And we wrote it all in different learning styles because we appreciate that what might work in Peckham in southeast London, where God actually lives, may be different to Belfast or to Birmingham and to other places across the UK. And the deal was this: we would train churches to run Kintsugi groups, and in their community, it was for their community. And realizing that before the pandemic, there was a mental health crisis. This map here shows you where we were working, and churches were coming to London for 2-day training, and it was fascinating. Some churches were going, I'll run this as a cell group. Other churches were like, well, we could run this before Alpha. And then other churches were going, well, we'd quite like to run it in a farmer's market. And I was like, why? And they said, because suicide rate amongst farmers is really high. Another group said, well, we're going to run it for domestic abuse survivors because obviously issues around mental health are huge. Others were like, well, we want to run it in schools, in universities and in prisons. And there's someone in Scotland just started talking about running it in a hairdresser's, which I thought was brilliant because hairdressers are half therapists, half hairdressers, right? And this movement started. And then COVID hit. And I thought, that's it, we're doomed. We've had it. But then my techie guy, he managed to move all the training online. And so any church can run it from across the country. They link into social prescribing teams with GPs. They're linking in with local schools, local services. And so this is where Kintsugi works today. We've just done some evaluation and around 10,000 people have been through Kintsugi groups, and that's 400 churches, 1,500 leaders. And the stories are incredible. They're just so moving. People saying, this has saved my life. A third of people coming to Kintsugi groups aren't from the church. They're coming from outside the church. And I love all these stats. They're great. But you know what? Every statistic is a person. Every one of those dots on there represents 10, 12, 15 people. And before we get into the sort of crux of the interview that Mark wanted to do, I thought I'd just share this story with you. This is from a very precious lady called June.
I was born and brought up in a shop, over a sweet shop and tobacconist, with a father who had mental health problems, who didn't really want to be a shopkeeper at all, and a mother who was very subservient. A twin brother who was incredibly clever. We were constantly compared, as you can imagine, but it never seemed to bother me that much. You know, I really wasn't a competitive person anyway, so I was always very pleased for him when he achieved, but I think I gave up on myself. I ended up thinking, well, I don't know what love feels like. I know I am loved, but I don't think I know what that feels like, really. So that's been my quest, I think, in life, has been to try and find out that. I used to view myself as weak, sensitive, quite negatively, whereas now, since I've been on this Kintsugi journey, I see all those things as gifts. You know, you can be compassionate when you're sensitive. You can have a lot of empathy when you've been through stuff yourself. I heard Patrick Regan speak, He did the Honesty Over Silence tour, and afterwards he said, would I consider doing a pilot group for the Kintsugi Hope course. Didn't know what I was taking on at the time, and felt terribly insecure about the whole thing, because I just thought, well, what am I going to do? I don't know enough about these things. And then I realised you don't have to do very much, actually. The material was there in all different learning styles. All you had to do was turn up, be honest, say me too. I'm not an expert, I'm one of you. And I think that's hugely empowering for people. The greatest treasure is in finding Kintsugi and following a way of being. To accept who I am, warts and all. I'm not going to be perfect. I'll try, I'll do my best. But, and to show kindness and gentleness and love to people. That's what I found out what love is. Yeah.
Thanks, Patrick. That was a gorgeous little story.
Yeah.
Just going back to your sort of OBE, I mean, part of the reason I was asking that is because someone other than the church is recognizing a contribution that you through the church have made in community, in the area that you lived in, London, and now with Kintsugi Hope Beyond. And I suppose I just wanted to celebrate the fact that actually we can share mission with other organizations beyond the church, and that does now allow us to connect with beyond the 5% who do go to church. And you mentioned a third of people from Kintsugi don't go to church. So that's again a fantastic way that we're reaching out into our wider communities to help people. So bless you for that. And it's been fantastic to hear the success of Kintsugi being adopted by so many churches and as a tool to reach out into our communities. Before I start asking you some more questions, I just wanted to mention a statistic I'd heard about families supporting families in this country. A recent UNICEF UK report reveals that over half of all families with young children in Britain are struggling financially or with their mental health, and that children's futures are at risk unless more support is provided. And a second, fact is that more than a third of parents have struggled to see a healthcare professional when their very young child was unwell, and 1 in 10 report not receiving any of their minimum health visits. So it's just one specific example of some of the experiences that families and people in our communities are facing due to the cost of living crisis, due to the pandemic crisis, that there are huge cuts in our communities and huge effects for people that is affecting their well-being, their shalom well-being. So, Patrick, within that kind of context, I wanted to ask you, how can we show and develop a compassionate response to what we see happening in our communities?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I've just been in a learning community. Actually, it's a global community where there's a new course called Compassionate Leadership, which is looking at how do you lead with compassion, how do you how do you lead with compassion and for compassion. And I think compassion is about recognizing someone else's struggle and taking practical steps to help, however so small. And I think the word compassion is a really important word. It means to feel someone else's pain, to alleviate that. but it doesn't mean about absorbing their pain. And what's really interesting is that compassion as a word is a verb, and compassion involves awareness, it involves connection, it involves empathy, and it involves action. And one of the things I found absolutely fascinating about this course is looking at how empathy works with a different part of our brains than what compassion works with. And what I think is a massive challenge for people working in communities is often people who are church leaders, people on calls like this, have incredible empathy with people. They really do feel people's pain. That's why you bother to turn up on a Tuesday afternoon or whatever it is. But it also can lead us to burnout and exhaustion and not knowing what to do with that. And compassion, on the other hand, is all about action. And so I've been doing a lot of writing recently around something around the Israel and Hamas war, and talking about empathy and compassion, and how that we need to spread stigma. We need to spread compassion, not stigma. And I think that's a really important thing, is like, you know, whenever Jesus did anything, it was out of that sense of compassion, wasn't it? When he healed the man with leprosy, filled with compassion, he reached out and touched a man who was completely, obviously, lonely and isolated. Matthew 9, I think, where it talks about the crowd being harassed and helpless like a sheep without a shepherd, it said, filled with compassion, Jesus touched him. So my prayer, Mark, is to stay full of that sense of compassion, that connection, that awareness, that empathy, but to realize that I'm not a sponge for people's pain as well, and I'm not the rescuer. You know, Jesus is the rescuer. And I think that as we do that, we start looking at our ministries and going, how compassionate is our ministry? How compassionate is our outreach? How compassionate is the things that we are doing with and among our communities?
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess there's two levels that we need to think about this as individuals, how we learn and develop empathy, and take steps of action, but also as organizations, as churches, and certainly as united, a network of churches working together in their towns and cities. Can you speak to us, those kind of three levels at all, about what it means, how we actually move forward with this?
So what's the first level you're talking about as an individual?
As an individual, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always about working with people and not doing things for people. And I think that connection is what we've always tried to do. You know, how do we work with people? How do we understand where people are at? How do we come alongside? Because one size never fits all, right? And we live in very diverse communities that will look different to different people. But I've always found it important to think with and not for. And because I feel like sometimes, you know, there's a time to do things for people, but if we're not careful, it can come quite patronizing, like it's a charity, it's a handout. And I've always been conscious that what people really need is that to walk alongside, you know. And I remember I went and did some work in a church in the States, and there were 300 people in this church, and 50% of them were homeless, and another large percentage were working poor. And I remember saying to the church leader, how do you do it? And they were like, well, we need each other. We need each other. There is no them and us. There's just us. And yep, they do meals for the homeless, but actually there's a washing up rota that involves everyone, because it's our project. And so I think constantly asking the with question is so important. I think in terms of connecting with communities, I think it's about asking what are the key needs in our communities. You know, it's about listening, about trying to understand and what's going on. I know in many communities, obviously where Kintsugi Hope works, huge issues around mental health, and particularly among youth, to be honest. I've got a teenage daughter, and she said to me, every single member in the class has self-harmed at some point, out of the girls there. And I went, well, that means you have. And she went, yeah, it didn't do anything for me, Dad, but we all did it. And because it's just what you do when you're at a certain age to try and cope with what life is chucking at you. We've had other situations. I was in a school recently, doing something for year 11, and they'd had 3 kids try and overdose in that one school. And And I think the beautiful thing about, again, Kintsugi Hope was it isn't one size fits all. So you take what's there and you adapt it to the community that you're trying to serve, realizing that everyone wants to belong and everyone needs connection.
Yeah.
So if you work on that basis, knowing that we've got to bring connection, we've got to bring a sense of belonging and a sense of love, and then you start to see real tangible change. But yeah, huge issues for us to grapple with.
Yeah, so just on empathy, there's that wonderful video by Brené Brown that people can Google and see on YouTube about what empathy is versus sympathy, which is so helpful, isn't it?
Yeah.
But I'm just thinking now about how we, help young people develop empathy. I think some of it is about, as you said, about connection, didn't you? So it's perhaps being with people who are suffering, and actually by being with them, that empathy does come, doesn't it, or grow. I think also Kintsugi Hope, your groups are that peer support is a place where empathy actually does grow. Could you maybe sort of share about that?
Yeah, I mean, empathy, I think, again, that sense of sharing with, taking the perspective of another. But I think you have to be really careful with empathy, actually, because I think Brené Brown does say this, not on that particular video that you were mentioning, but she says empathy isn't feeling someone else's pain for them, because that's basically transference, and that's what leads to burnout. Empathy is so it's not standing in someone else's shoes, it's about believing them when they describe what it's like to stand in their shoes, and listening, and maybe getting in touch with that emotion where, if they say it was lonely, getting in touch with a moment where you felt lonely. But I think let's not kid ourselves that it's feeling someone else's pain, because we all have different DNA, we all have different families, we all have different circumstances that we're being brought up in. And so that's why I think it's really important that any empathy is leading to compassion, which is about doing something. It's a verb. It means that our young people aren't left feeling helpless, that there's a sense we can do something no matter what it is together, that we can bring comfort, that we can make a difference. And you're right. I mean, in Kintsugi, we see that all the time. And I think one of the big issues that in our society, whether it's young people or old people, is the issue of shame, and we've seen people come into Kintsugi groups and just are so ashamed of what's happened. They don't believe that they're worthy of love or connection. It's interesting. I haven't done a Zoom meeting for a while, and it just reminds me of some of the early Kintsugi groups where people would basically be in a silhouette where you couldn't see their face. And I remember this one particular mum, she'd lost her kid to foster care. And so if you lost your kid to foster care, basically judges said you're not fit to be a mum. And we talked about shame, and we talked about empathy on that particular week 4. And we talked about what Brené Brown says, that shame loves silence, secrecy, and judgment. Shame has 2 gremlins. Who do you think you are? And you're not enough. And you step out of shame by owning your story. And week 5, she had a camera on for the first time, and you could see her face. And I always think that's what Jesus did. He always dealt with people's shame before their guilt, whether it's Zacchaeus up a tree, whether it was a woman with a blood disorder, whether it was a blind man at the side of the road. He always dealt with shame before he dealt with guilt, and then often, confessional sin came afterwards. And I wonder whether that's a really lovely model to be able to see ministry in our very, very fragile communities. Yeah.
That's great. Now, just a kind of another sort of story, really. In Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, the churches there have been working with the mayor over the last 12 months to the point where they've agreed a project called Movement for Recovery, where they're going to try and harness and partner with the 600 churches across the county with the ICS, the integrated care system there. But what was interesting to me about meeting with the mayor and having discussions with church leaders there is that the mayor has got values stated in 3 words: compassion, cooperation, and community. So your point to, about how we develop a compassionate response, I think is really helpful, because as we speak to our civic leaders, it's good that we have a bit of a vision for what a compassionate response looks like. So I'd like to kind of ask you a bit more really about what tangible hope looks like in our communities. What would you say about that?
I think tangible hope looks like it will look different in different communities, won't it? But I think it involves relationship connection. It involves that connection. It involves that belonging before you believe, and that for many places will be. For me, it's just any charity that isn't based on long-term relationship building has the potential to do more harm than good. And I think that if we have that in our mind, that everything is about long-term relationship building, it's about loving without an agenda. It's about not wanting to fix, but wanting to come alongside. And that doesn't mean that we don't talk about the love of Jesus. Of course we do. I mean, we see people come to faith in our Kintsugi groups all the time. And it's not because we try and sneak in the gospel at the end in a 5-minute talk. It's because people start talking about faith and pain and hope and transformation, and it comes out of relationship, and it is a beautiful thing. But I think we've really got to keep on that sense of, how do I build connection? How do I build belonging? And how do we join the dots? I think is really important. And Mark, I know a lot of food banks now and Kintsugi groups are working together because they realize that poverty is a symptom of mental health. It's also a cause of poor mental health. And actually, when I've spoken to mayors and civic leaders, which I do all the time, is they actually like that thinking of, oh my goodness, you're joining the dots, because sometimes actually things are quite siloed in particular ways of working. And so I've always said to people, I represent an infrastructure that is incredible, because there is a church in every community across this country. And with all due respect to politicians and other people, we will outlast you. We will outlast 5 years, and we are committed to be there, not just for our members, but for the people that are there in our communities. And I think that relationship building is really important, particularly what I'm finding with GPs and social prescribing. That's been a massive. There's a GP surgery rang us up the other day, and they were like, "We just thank God that you exist, because we are inundated." I had a doctor say a young person has to be on a bridge ready to jump before we have capacity to do anything. And so the whole of our civic society is so built for crisis management. And I think what we're saying is, actually, to see long-term change, it's got to be relational.
Brilliant. And I mean, the wonder of Kintsugi is that, there are 12 sessions, aren't there, which in terms of being a tangible hope, there can be lots of obstacles to people's hope. Was it Jean in the video that you played? Was that her name, Jean?
Yeah.
She was talking about her experience of not knowing what love felt like for her. But just talk us through those sessions very quickly, because there are different things that perhaps unlock obstacles for different, for people's different situations.
Yeah, I mean, we hit all the big topics. So, like, things around honesty, there's anxiety, stigma, shame, depression, resilience, forgiveness, healthy relationships, really interesting. Police will tell us that you are never 100 yards away from a domestic violence case anywhere in the UK. And in rural communities, it's slightly more, because the houses are a little bit spread out. It's the pandemic no one wants to talk about and no one wants to face, but it's huge. And so we do a whole thing around healthy relationships, the power of stepping away when a relationship goes toxic, resilience. And we talk about resilience not as resistance, which again is a total misunderstanding of the word resilience. So it's all about tools and techniques. But I think, Mark, the challenge for us as the church is to communicate in a way, if I can say this humbly, in a way that people can actually understand. I think we have a jargon and a language, and that we have developed over the years. And I know people catch your heart when you say things, but I think we really need to try and communicate with a bit more humility sometimes. I was sitting in my office about a year ago, and I have got hundreds of theology books, and Christian books, and I was like, I don't have one book I would give to a non-Christian friend, not one.
Yeah.
And I have testimony books which might work if they're a little bit interested, but I've got nothing that talks about well-being or holistic well-being and physical health, mental health and emotional health or spiritual health. And so I spent the last year trying to write a book which is going to do that and open up that conversation. And it got published a month ago, and fascinatingly, like, we've had schools buy a copy for every year 11 pupil. We've had the media open up to us like we've never seen before.
Wow.
And we're all asking about spiritual health as well as physical and mental health. And I think it's just sometimes it's just knowing that we have to go in with a certain attitude, and I think that attitude has to be humility.
Yeah. I mean, we've seen this winter the warm welcome spaces open up again.
Yeah.
A really exciting mass movement of churches opening their doors to the community, and offering connection. I mean, I think in terms of equipping, things like Kintsugi Hope are such a brilliant resource to help us, actually go deeper with people, because it seems like, that in the story of Jean there, that actually her hearing from others, she could connect with that sort of same story, that really, opened the door for her healing and progress, didn't it? Which is exciting.
Yeah.
So warm welcome spaces. That's a real opportunity this winter. I wonder whether we could, do you have any other thoughts in terms of how we offer, that tangible hope to our communities this Christmas, Patrick? Any examples you want to kick us off with? And I'll perhaps go around the group for any thoughts or suggestions that we've got.
Yeah, I mean, I think for Christmas, we were looking at the whole idea of Blue Christmas, actually, because Christmas for a lot of people is the most depressing time of the year, because it's a time where that if you've lost someone, and you tend to remember them more. If you've been through a time of loss, whether that's a marriage breakdown or a complex family time. And so I think that we have to, the church is in a beautiful place to create safe and supportive spaces where people can grieve. Not everyone's going to want to celebrate Christmas in exactly the same way. Or if you're like me, actually, I spoke at Jean's funeral not that long ago, and I dedicated my new book. So she was an inspiration. And what I love about Jean is she's nothing like me. She's not those sort of, I think sometimes in the church we have a way of honoring the people that have got a big mouth and can talk in front of lots of people. She's not like that. She's humble, she's kind, and there were 300 people and everyone had a Jean story. Everyone had a Jean story. And I wonder whether at Christmas that there'll be ways of actually, maybe just doing a service that is remembering people who have gone, who we loved and respected, and just allowing God into that space. And Blue Christmas it started to gain momentum as each year goes on, but I think it's a beautiful thing to do, and I think it's something that our communities would really benefit from.
Yeah, just acknowledging where people really are at. That's wonderful. And presumably we can find out about that through the Kintsugi Hope website. Is that right?
To be honest, it's not a Kintsugi thing. If you just Google Blue Christmas, you'll see there's loads of resources out there. I'm not plugging this as a Kintsugi thing. It's just something I think is special at Christmas. And I think, Christmas is stressful. So, I did a talk recently not recently, for last Christmas, but we're going to use it now, called A Mentally Healthy Christmas. What are those things that we can do? I think Christmas is when all our perfectionist comes out, particularly on the day itself. It has to be perfect, whether that's the food, the presents, the family, and it rarely is. So what tools can we give people to equip them leading up to Christmas would be another good thing to ask ourselves.
That's fantastic. You may have just answered the question for us, but let's just go around the group. I want us to think about, first of all, us as individuals, reaching individuals in our community, and then think about more corporately and collectively as churches. But guys, we've got you on the call. Thank you so much for being part of this. Can I just invite you to open your mics and maybe just share how you think we can offer a real and tangible hope to individuals as individuals.
Hi there. Yeah, I'm thinking about just simple hospitality in our homes, welcoming people into our homes, people, whether they're lonely or just our neighbours, way to get to know people. Christmas is a nice opportunity. Put out some Christmas food, keep it simple, but practicing hospitality, getting to know people a little better in homes, conversation starts to flow. People start to feel really cared for. We're showing interest in their lives, that kind of thing. Yeah, simple hospitality.
Thanks, Alex. That's a great one. Anybody want to add to another idea for us on that? Alison.
So we're doing a Christmas hamper scheme, which is through the referrals come through the BSM. But one of the key things is that we get people to deliver the hampers to the recipients, so that there's a conversation, there's a connection, and the potential to invite people to a Blue Christmas service or one of the other Christmas services that we're running. So there's that practical thing. It's all about giving some luxury items as well as basics, but it's about the connection and the actual meeting people in your local community.
Thanks, Alison. That's a great example. Anybody else? Steve, thanks.
I think, as you know, one of my hobby horses is making sure that we think about the workplace. And there's so much stress in the workplace, and equipping the saints for the work of ministry in the workplace is not always well done within a church setting. And yet I've come across situations where colleagues have come up to me and said, I think David's going to commit suicide tonight.
Wow.
And others have come up to me and say, we're really at rock bottom, the marriage is coming to an end, our finances are in a mess. And I had one situation where somebody called me into the office and said, I went home last night and found my wife in bed with my best friend. And you go, I've never been in situations where we've been equipped to deal with that. And I would just love to see far more meaningful equipping to meet the stresses where you're facing them in that sort of very straightforward but immediate way.
Yeah. Thanks, Steve. I mean, the Zero Suicide Alliance is really well worth searching. A 20-minute online course to help you ask a work colleague, a stranger, or family member or a friend whether they're having suicidal feelings. We know by asking that question that it reduces suicide rates. So that's something practical we can do on an individual basis. So thank you. Patrick, I just saw that you popped in a comment there. Do you want to just say what that was? I've can't quite see it now.
Yeah, no, just to say I totally agree with what Steve was saying. Actually, what we've done is we've just started a subsidiary company of Kintsugi Hope called brighterdays.life, which is to deliver wellbeing training into the businesses, into education, and into public services. So it's been really exciting. I felt really convicted that I was spending most of my time speaking to Christians, which is great because Christians are nice and it's good. But now I'm spending most of my time actually speaking in the corporate world. And what we do is we take the funds from the corporate world and we go and speak into prisons and rehabs and homeless shelters. And so it's a bit like Robin Hood a little bit. But it's great because we a couple of weeks ago, I spoke to 70 members of Lincolnshire County Council exec, and I did a whole like 4-hour session with them, which was amazing. And the things that come out of there and the church connections in Lincoln are fantastic, and what they're doing. So I think, again, joining these dots where we can. So we're looking for any opportunities you got in workplaces. Do let us know, because we've got some really, really good programs now.
Amazing, Patrick. I just want to show you this slide as we think about what we do collectively. Alison had that brilliant example of Christmas hampers that are given out, and I know many church networks across the country do that. We certainly have one in Bolton where we are called Christmas on Jesus, and it's a lovely exercise of churches taking responsibility for collecting particular ingredients to go in those hampers, whether it's the stuffing or whether it's the cranberry jelly or whatever it is. And but yeah, Alison also made mention of that real personal connection of delivery from someone, and that sort of personal contact. So there are lots of things that lots of support for churches to engage in terms of supporting people with hope and joy and their mental health, their spiritual health. A great starting point here on the left-hand side is the Kintsugi Hope mental health friendly church training, which just helps us all to embrace how we create a gentle presence and a real welcome for people to talk about their mental health, to help them be vulnerable and not to feel stigma or shame. There's also other things we can do, so we can help our communities get more active. And if you'd like to think about strategies for getting your community more active, whether it's running groups or football groups or anything at all, then do get in touch with Gather Movement, and we can talk to you about different examples we've seen from around the country that have worked well. Patrick mentioned social prescribing, and again, this is an area of huge potential for the church to make a massive difference in our communities. And also connecting with our medical centres as well, as we work together to help people find social activities that really benefit their mental health and well-being. Linking Lives is the organisation that's mentioned there. They do a Two's Company befriending project and will provide training for that. So recommend looking at that organisation. In terms of actually getting into more depth with well-being courses, a peer-supported course, then the course that Kintsugi runs is absolutely fantastic, and one that we strongly recommend you look at. And there's a package of really good resources to use for that, and really great training that's provided to equip churches to run this. And you can do it in conjunction with your medical practice. There is the opportunity to get people socially prescribed to those groups. And then into crisis support. We talked about the Zero Suicide Alliance. But there are other things that churches can do, from opening nightlight centres that are open to people who are really overwhelmed by their mental health. And in places like Lincoln, there's a great partnership with the NHS and referring people through the NHS to the church for these nightlight centres. And there are other things that can be done as well. So Gather Movement has created with Kintsugi this resource that you can download from our website. So if you wanted to read more about what we can offer in terms of a real and tangible hope for our communities, and help people grow in joy and peace as well, then this is a resource that's well worth looking at. I guess the final point I wanted to make about this is that whilst churches can offer a huge amount themselves to their community, there is also the opportunity to, if you like, increase and maximize their impact by linking up with other churches. And so we'd encourage you to download the resource again on the Gather Movement website about link hubs and about the opportunity there is to increase our impact in our communities. So it's on the understanding that one church can't do everything. It can't run every service that's needed, and it can't reach every person across a town or a city. But actually, as a network of churches, we can do ever so much more. So I want to just encourage you to think about that model. And if that's something that you can share with your Unity group and there's interest in, then Gather Movement would love to talk to you more about that. Are there any thoughts or questions that you might have at this point to ask Patrick whilst we've got him?
You're talking earlier, Patrick, about youth mental health. We've been doing some work in Birmingham with the mayor's office and gathering young people together from across not the faiths. But what's really come through is how my generation don't understand why they should be having these problems, and therefore there is that lack of empathy. Because the intensity of the situations that are hitting our young people at the moment are just so many different issues. It'd just be worth picking up a little bit more about your resources and support into young people, because I think there's a crisis, but I don't think many people are taking the crisis seriously enough.
No, there is. And so what we did with the youth side of mental health is that we changed it to a 6-week program as opposed to a 12-week program. So basically you can run Kintsugi Hope Youth in a school or in a youth club, and it has gone down very, very well. In fact, in Andover, the school there have made it part of the curriculum, so every single child has to go through a Kintsugi Hope group, which is incredible. We're also, interestingly enough, I've seen schools ask us to come in and do training for parents, because what they're seeing that as a school community, they're doing quite a lot in terms of mental health, but then the kids go home and then within hours it's undone because the parents don't look after their own mental health. So if they don't look after their own mental health, then it's not modeled particularly well, and these conversations aren't happening. And so I think it's really important. I think the other thing, just to say on young people, is we've got to remember that this generation, they had a death counter on their television for about 2.5 years with COVID. They've watched now 2 wars being outplayed on TikTok. So the graphic images that they don't watch the news. They don't see the things like we're seeing them. They don't view the things the way we're viewing them. They are seeing just the most horrendous stuff being outplayed from the battlefields. And then you've got climate change and all what that might mean for the future. So this generation, you talk about tangible hope, that they're wondering where the tangible hope is. And so again, yes, if I could encourage any church to get involved in running a Kintsugi youth in a school or in their youth group, it's so important at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, outreach to schools is a real rallying cry, isn't it? We need to do what we can. Just to encourage you, I had the opportunity with my work to visit some really exciting work that the church is doing around the country. And yesterday I was in Leeds, and there was an evening session called Kids Club, where 300 children from across the city of Leeds were bussed in on buses to Bridge Community Church, I think it is, in Leeds, for their kids club. And just fantastic evening of presenting the gospel to them in a really interactive way for children age 6 through to 11. And then the buses take them all back home, and there's a sort of a organized bus set of stops, so people know where if they want to come, they're at a bus stop at a certain time on a Monday night. But then after that event, a youth worker will visit each family once a week to offer an activity sheet for the child to do. But it's also a way of just building a relationship with the family. And I was absolutely blown away by that project and how long it's been going, how well it's run. So yeah, do have a look out for that. But those are the kind of ambitious things that I think as a church we ought to be thinking about in terms of our young people. Dwayne, I can see you've got your hand up, but where are you calling in from today, Dwayne?
Well, funny enough, I'm calling in from Leeds. So when you just mentioned Kids Club, I was just like, yeah, they've been running for so many years and they're an absolutely fantastic organization. So I'm really, really glad that you got to meet with them. But yes, Leeds. But I do have a question for Patrick. It was just in regards to the stats that you gave just before COVID, in regards to what was happening with mental health, and then COVID happened. And then obviously we had that whole epidemic of mental health being a thing now. Where are we at now in 2023? And also, what is the church's response to all of this? Because we see that the schools are crying out, the systems are crying out for help. But my question is really, where are the churches and what are their responses at this moment in time?
Great, thank you so much. So if you go online, there's a report just out. It's a cross-party report called A Mental Healthy Nation. And that will give you the latest statistics in terms of what's going on. And I think that the trend of what they're seeing is that what's made the mental health crisis even worse, obviously COVID had a massive part of it, but is the cost of living crisis. And so poverty is a cause of poor mental health. It's a symptom of poor mental health. And so what the report is looking at is it's a cross-party report, which is always good. And it's taken a long time to do. It's looking at what's proactive. It's also looking at issues around racial injustice, actually, again, which massive impacts on mental health. And but I think the church is doing a lot more than it used to in this area. I feel like traditionally that the church has been very good at poverty fighting. We've had lots of initiatives like CAP and Food Bank and other issues. And then we were quite animated about the crime, and street pastors came out and some of the other things, and night pastors and street angels and stuff. But and there are more mental health projects. You know, when Mind and Soul Foundation, who are run by very close friends of mine, when they started about 15, 20 years ago, no one was talking about this. And now there is awareness. But I would say it's patchy. I would say it's really patchy. And we did a report, Dwayne, on mental health attitudes within church. It was a paper we produced actually with Theos, which is an independent think tank, academic think tank. And the interesting thing was it came out with 3 really interesting findings. Number one was 90% of church leaders had no training in mental health at all. So it wasn't taught at Bible colleges. There's a pastoral care module, but actually, you know, we can understand Greek and Hebrew, but spotting anxiety or that's harder to do. So there was a cry really to Bible colleges and people that are training ministers to look at more what does mental health and how do we support people with mental health. The second thing was that 50% of churches had no position on mental health, if you like. And so they were neutral. So what that meant was that mental health was very rarely preached about from a Sunday, and maybe a couple of times a year. And there was a real confused theology, I would say. There was a lot of, is it demonic? Is it spiritual? Is it not spiritual? Where does that work? How does that work? What about Jesus's ministry? And what does Paul mean when he says be anxious about nothing? You know, so there was a very confused theology, and some churches were grappling with that and understanding that, and others weren't at all. But of course, if you struggle with a mental health issue and it's never preached about, then it doesn't really help you at all. And then thirdly, and this is where it got more encouraging, is where churches were doing really well with mental health is when they've learned to be a gentle presence in their community. And I love that phrase, gentle presence. And that may mean a well-being cafe, you know, from Renewed, who are like Ruth Rice and those guys who do a great job at that. It might mean running a course with Sanctuary, or running a Kintsugi Hope group, but what does it mean to be a gentle presence in our community? And I think what was nice about that is we can't all be mental health experts, we can't all be psychologists, but you know what, we can all take our mate for a coffee, and we can all take our help our community and our neighbors. And so it's like, what does being a gentle presence look like? And so I think it is starting to filter through, and I think it is starting to become more of the conversation. I hope it becomes more mainstream. I feel like it's a bit like the seminar at a big conference rather than the main stage at the moment. And I think that well-being in the whole, spiritual, emotional, physical, mental, behavioral well-being should be spoken about together. And I think if we can get to that, then we'll have more whole people.